Welcome everybody to today's webinar here at BINA. So, what's the most important thing in life? Is it academic achievement? Is it being a good person? What should we emphasize to our children? How should we bring up our children? Should we overemphasize the importance of academic achievement? Should we emphasize the importance of good values, of morality, of ethics? What should we be focusing on? Now, let's first discuss this in a more secular way. What I mean to say, not about learning Torah, which is a different story altogether, like we'll see soon, but let's just discuss this on a very basic level for everybody, for all of humanity. Education obviously is very important, and so is academics. We cannot have doctors in the world, we cannot have scientists in the world, we cannot have lawyers in the world, and we cannot have any profession, for the most part, in the world, without people properly studying for it, people being equipped with the right information, and of course, people who have excelled in these areas have brought much good to the world. All advances in medicine and science and discovery are all unbelievable things. But what's important to understand is that these things will only be good if they are practiced and learnt by good people. If an evil person studies medicine, if an evil person studies science, if an evil person studies anything and excels in it and makes him or herself big in these things, that can actually bring terrible destruction in the world. So in other words, what comes out is that all of these things are all very important, but at the end of the day, very important vehicles, tools that can be used to do good and increase goodness in the world. But the tools will only be used correctly if the person using those tools is a good person and has good roots, is based in morality and in ethics. So, in other words, these things are very important, but they're only important and they only work for the good if they are learned and practiced by good people. And therefore, what really comes out is if we're talking about education and imparting to our children what's important, what's actually the most important is not academics. What's the most important is to educate our children to be good people, to be upright people, to be moral people, to be ethical people, to be nice people, to think about other people. In that context, we should teach them things. In that context, we should help them and encourage them to excel in academics, but not to make an idol out of academics, not to make an idol out of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, because knowledge for the sake of knowledge can lead you anywhere. Knowledge has caused much good in the world, of course, but knowledge has also caused much bad in the world, as we just said. So, we need to teach these things and we need to emphasize these things, but again, all within the framework and the context of being a good person. But that's, generally speaking, for all of humanity. How does this apply to us Jews when we study the Torah? Torah is very intellectual, one can say very academic. So does the same thing apply? So on the one hand, what one needs to make the distinction is that Torah is inherently holy. Torah is God's wisdom. The very fact that you sit down over a verse in the Chumash or a page in the Talmud or whatever it is, that itself connects you to God. There is an inherent value, there's an essential value to that because it says that God puts himself into the Torah. So in other words, Torah, you can't put down Torah learning as merely an academic exercise. Torah learning itself is inherently valuable. But what might be interesting and what might be surprising to some is even Torah learning can be done in the wrong way. In other words, even Torah learning has to be done within a certain context and within a certain framework. The Talmud tells us what seems to be a very extreme statement. It says, Zocha, if you merit, if you learn Torah properly, Nasi sloi sam chayim, it becomes like a potion of life. Loi Zocha, if you don't merit, it actually becomes a potion of the opposite of life. What does that mean? Isn't Torah holy? Isn't Torah godly? How can Torah be so destructive? So I'll share with you a fascinating concept, which actually comes into and is taught within the passage of the Talmud, which talks about the holiday of Hanukkah, which we're going to start celebrating tomorrow night. This passage of the Talmud is in Tractate Shabbos. In fact, there is no tractate in the Talmud which is totally dedicated to Hanukkah, unlike Purim, where there's an entire tractate called Megillah, but there's no tractate Hanukkah. There's no Masechtas Hanukkah. All the laws of Hanukkah and the story of Hanukkah are all spoken about in Masechtas Shabbos, in the tractate which talks about Shabbos. It comes within the context of Shabbos candles, and the Gemara starts comparing Shabbos candles to Hanukkah candles, and then it digresses and starts talking about Hanukkah. And it goes through all the various laws. Somewhere in the middle, the Gemara interrupts the topic of Hanukkah and mentions something which seems to be totally unrelated. And I'll just quote to you. It says as follows. Rav Kahana says that Rabbi Nosson taught in the name of last week's Torah portion, when the brothers threw Yosef into a pit, and it says that the pit was empty and there was no water. So the Gemara asks, that's a double expression. What do you mean it was empty and it was no water? Of course, if it was empty, there was no water. Says the Talmud, what it's trying to tell me, there wasn't water, but there were nechoshim va'akravim, which means there were snakes and scorpions. That's what it means. It was empty, but what is empty of what? Empty of water, but it wasn't empty of other things. And then the Gemara goes back to the topic of Hanukkah. Now, simply speaking, whoever has learned Talmud will know that a lot of times the Talmud digresses into topics totally unrelated, and a lot of times that happens because the Talmud will say something about the topic which is discussing that somebody said, in this case, Rav Kahana. And then since we're talking about things that Rav Kahana said, we mention another thing that Rav Kahana said, even if it's totally unrelated. But of course we know that Torah, nothing is by chance, and therefore it's obviously nicer and would fit better if we can find some sort of connection between this statement and Hanukkah. What is the deeper spiritual meaning behind this statement? That it was empty of water, but not empty of other things. The Medrash tells us, Ein mayim ela Torah. Water actually is an analogy and refers to Torah learning. And therefore what the statement is actually saying, if you don't have Torah learning, there's no middle ground. If you're empty of Torah, you're not just a dry pit, you actually have snakes and scorpions, which is like the opposite. In other words, you're not only devoid of holiness, you even have negative things as well. Why? What does that mean? So the truth is actually that Torah is compared to many things. Torah is compared to oil, Torah is compared to bread, Torah is compared to water, Torah is compared to wine. In various verses, various midrashim, various places. But everything that Torah is compared to, there's a reason why it's compared to that. What is the significance of water? Why is Torah compared to water? So the Talmud tells us, just like water goes from a high place to a low place, so too Torah learning has to be done b'mi sheda'ato shvela, which means somebody who is humble, somebody who has humility. In other words, in order for Torah to be learned properly, one needs to be humble. And this is actually a novelty. This is very surprising. In fact, we say in the Shemona Esrei 3 times a day, at the end, in the last paragraph, Elokai Mitzor, we say, "V'nafshi ka'ofer lakoil tiyeh," which means my soul shall be like dust for everybody, which means I should feel very, very humble. And the next statement we say is, "Psach libi b'soirasecha," open up my heart to your Torah. What's the connection between the 2 parts of the statement? And the answer is, this is the exact same point. Torah is compared to water. In order to learn Torah properly, in order to come to the proper conclusion, one needs to approach Torah with absolute humility, which again is a novelty. Generally speaking, when you want to understand something, you need to be very present. It has to be how I think. You need to use your brains. It's not negating the self, it's using the self. You need to be present. You need to try to understand. You need to question when you don't understand. How does that work together with humility? Because the truth is that Torah is not a regular intellectual exercise. It's not an academic exercise. Torah is God's wisdom. God is infinite and so is his wisdom. The only way a finite human being can understand infinite wisdom is actually if we approach Torah to begin with, we approach Torah that actually I understand nothing. The way I see things, the way I understand things is totally irrelevant here. Because the way I understand things is the way a finite human being understands things, and I'm about to approach infinite wisdom. Now, obviously, when you're actually learning, you need to try and understand, because that's what God did. God put his infinite wisdom in a way that we can understand it. But to begin with, to approach it, you need to come with absolute humility. You need to come with the water of Torah. You need to come with the approach that I am nothing here, I really don't understand anything, and I'm coming to understand what God has to say, and not to try fit the way I see things, my agendas, into Torah. And that is the meaning of this sentence. It was an empty pit, but empty of water, but there were snakes and scorpions. Because if one doesn't approach Torah this way, if one approaches Torah as a simple academic exercise, that I'm just trying to understand things the way I understand things, not only will you not understand Torah, it'll actually be nechashim va'akrabim, it'll be snakes and scorpions. You'll understand Torah wrong. Torah will actually damage you if you approach Torah that way. You can actually use Torah for your own negative agendas. In order to truly understand Torah properly, there needs to be mayim, there needs to be water. What's the connection to Hanukkah? Because Hanukkah, it says, we say in the Al Hanisim paragraph, which we say in the prayers of Hanukkah, we say, what did the Greeks want? We say, La'ashkicham Torasecha, which means they wanted to make us forget your Torah, talking to God, your Torah. Why don't we say your Torah? Why don't we just say, La'ashkicham Torah? They came to make us forget Torah. Why Torasecha? Why do we emphasize it's your Torah, God's Torah? The answer is because the Greeks were great academics. Great philosophers came from the Greeks. They had no problem at all. People learn Torah. Go ahead. Be an academic. Be smart. Be intellectual. But take the godliness out of Torah. They had a problem with Torah Secha. They had a problem with it being God's Torah. And that is what they fought against. And that is what the holiday of Hanukkah comes to teach us. One of the many things that it comes to teach us is that when we approach Torah and when we try to teach our children Torah, just like as we brought the analogy at the beginning, in any academic exercise, there needs to be the context, there needs to be the framework. The same thing applies to Torah, although, as I emphasized again, Torah is, to begin with, a totally different realm. It's God's wisdom, obviously. But even Torah, this is the novelty here, even Torah needs to be taught within a certain framework, that there needs to be a fear of heaven. There needs to be a fear of God as an introduction to learning Torah. So, in conclusion, is academics the most important thing? Absolutely not. In a general sense, any academics that we teach our children, any intellect, any knowledge that we impart to our children, needs to be within the framework of good ethics, of good morality. And even Torah, which is so holy and is God's wisdom, can also be taught in the wrong way and needs to be imparted to begin with, needs to be imparted in the context and the framework of a fear of God, of a subservience to God, and a fear of heaven. That when you come to learn Torah, you don't come with your own agendas, and you don't come with your own way of understanding things, but you're seeking to understand the way God sees things. And if we do this, just like by the miracle of Hanukkah, that one jug of oil, but it was pure jug of oil, lasted for 8 days and burned brightly, so too when we learn Torah ourselves and we try to impart Torah knowledge to our children, it may be small and it may be one jug, but it's pure. That pure jug of oil, that godly Torah, will last forever and brighten the darkness in the world. Have a wonderful day.